Well, hello all. Thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar, Managing and Maximizing Federal Grant Funding. My name is Erin Hurley. I serve as the Director of Government Affairs here at the National Association of Counties. So as many of you know, over the last 2 years, there has been a significant federal investment in county governments across the country. These include, but are not limited to, the American Rescue Plan, which of course provided $65.1 billion in direct flexible funding to every county across the country. This also includes the newly authorized bipartisan infrastructure law, the hazard mitigation grant program, as well as the community development block grant disaster recovery allocations. Each of these programs has provided new opportunities for counties to receive direct support either from our federal or state partners. And of course, now with this new influx of federal funding and funding that's available to counties, county leaders really have to navigate and understand the benefits and opportunities associated with each available resource and ultimately maximize these funding streams for community benefit while also avoiding any sort of duplication of funds as well. So with that, today we are joined by our partners at the Tidal Basin, who will provide a high-level overview of each of these programs and how counties can effectively and efficiently both maximize and invest these dollars at the local level. So I would like to introduce our guest speakers. Today we are joined by Jacob Gray, who serves as the Director of Mitigation at Tidal Basin. Also, Mark Mischak, the Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at Tidal Basin, and Dana Rubach, the Director of Community Development Block Grant, of course, also at Tidal Basin. And then just last, before I turn it over to our guest speakers, I want to remind those that are joining today that this webinar is being recorded, and we will post both the recording and the slides on our website after this webinar. So with that, I will turn it over to Jacob, Mark, and Dana. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great, thank you. I appreciate it. So we're going to go ahead and get the presentation up. We'll get that in presentation mode and start sharing with everyone. So Jacob, if we go to the next slide, I want to do a real quick introduction so everybody knows a little bit about our backgrounds. As mentioned, I'm the Chief Operating Officer and Senior Vice President for Tidal Basin. I've been doing work in the emergency management and grant world now for a little bit over 30 years. I spent 23 and a half of my years at FEMA running disaster programs, specifically those related to individuals and households, as well as some in public assistance and mitigation. So over the last 8.5 years, I've been working, in the private sector, at a national level to help our clients address their funding needs, to be able to be compliant with grant requirements, to be able to provide and augment for them what strategies they need to best take advantage of the dollars that are out there. Jacob, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Mark. Jacob Gray, Senior Director of Mitigation at Tidal Basin. Been here for about 3 years. Before that, I was the State Hazard Mitigation Officer in Kansas for a little over 12 years, and also our Logistics Chief in our State Emergency Operations Center for all of our disasters. So most of my working career has been in risk mitigation, whether it be man-made or nature-based disasters. Dana?
Yep. Hi, everyone. My name is Dana Rubach. I am a director with Tidal Basin's Housing, Community Development, and Infrastructure team. Been with Tidal Basin for about 2 years now, working with our clients mainly on their community development block grant disaster recovery funds. My background, I came to Tidal Basin from the city of New York, where I was the unit head managing the city's CDBG entitlement funding, as well as several years with their CDBGDR Hurricane Sandy recovery. Further than that, my background is really in small business development in the nonprofit sector. So had a fun little journey into this space, and really happy to be here with y'all today.
Fantastic. So, the direction. There we go. So the things that we're going to cover today is we're going to cover current funding streams, particularly ARPA, the infrastructure bill, COVID-19, HMGP, and the block grant 2020 and 2021 events. So we'll also talk more about managing and maximizing the funding that the county has received, as well as get into some Q&A, which we know, usually yields a lot of benefits. So I would just say when we get to the Q&A, obviously that is a very participatory part of the presentation. Oftentimes the best questions and even sometimes the best solutions come from within the group. So we want to make sure that we're staying true to NACo's principles and allowing everybody to share their experience and their knowledge. So 60 seconds about Tidal Basin. We're a comprehensive emergency management and project management, construction management consulting firm, mostly doing work with governments at the local, state, and federal level. We have over 37 years of professional services providing those services to different governments. Our team is mostly made up of former FEMA personnel, certified emergency managers, certified floodplain managers, construction managers, inspection managers, project and program managers, and engineers. We do specialize in providing personalized PMO oversight services, which essentially means across grant funding streams and across the full cycle of those grants, we can provide you with either strategic advice or staffing augmentation. So let's jump right in and start talking about the American Rescue Plan Act. So I'm going to cover that portion, and then we'll move into the mitigation part. So if we go to the next slide. Very good. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit here about ARPA. So, as already mentioned, $65.1 billion for counties. The final rule went into effect on April 1. And there are 4 major categories for the use. I'm going to share a little bit of additional detail. So it was, signed into law on March 11. Basically, it provides, a response to the COVID-19 public health emergency or its negative economic impacts, as well as a lot of ranged impacts. So the purpose of its use is, to provide, for the funding that was required to do assistance to households, small business, nonprofits, or to aid impacted industries such as tourism, travel, and hospitality, those things that have an economic impact in your jurisdictions. So it's also to provide premium pay to eligible state workers performing essential work during COVID-19 health emergencies, or providing grants to eligible employers that have eligible workers to perform that essential work. Also to provide government services to compensate for the reduction in revenue for the community due to the pandemic. A lot of people have seen that there's a lot of reduction in the revenue of sales tax and other things, right, for particular industries or in particular jurisdictions. Also, it leaves a very large general category to make necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. There are some restrictions that I'll mention. First, a newer restriction added is that funds cannot be used to make deposits into pension funds. Other restricted uses include not to service debts or to replenish reserves at the county level, as well as to pay settlements or judgments, or any of the general restrictions, which you can find on page 9 through 10 of the final rule. So distribution of funds, these funds are distributed and follow the rules that are laid down that HUD uses for the Community Development Block Grant Program, and the definitions follow those for metropolitan cities and for non-entitlement communities. Counties and metropolitan cities will receive their first direct payments from Treasury directly. Funds for non-entitlement communities are to be distributed via the states within 30 days of receipt. So, there's obviously a pass-through mechanism there that occurs. Treasury will advance these payments in 2 groupings. 50% of the local government total allocation is supposed to be distributed by May 10th. So coming up here very shortly. The remainder will be distributed not earlier than 12 months after the date on which the first group of funds is distributed. So these are funds that we're going to be dealing with this year and next year. Costs, however, must be incurred between March 1 and December 31, 2024. And when I say March 1, that's going back to 2020. So under the first legislation. So March 1, 2020 through December 31, 2024. So a couple of things that, I wanted to mention, just some examples of things, projects for folks to consider. Let me grab a couple that I wanted to share with you, and then we'll continue on with mitigation. So a couple of things. So I'll just say economic development is a key piece of what I think everybody has been dealing with post the event. One of the things that, I think that is important is to consider if there are particular industries that have been disrupted by COVID or maybe not going to return, to normal status in your community. There has been a lot of talk about how you can put in place workforce programs to design or help or boost new industries, things that you believe are in best interest for your future. So there's a lot of work involved at the city planning level about what you want your communities to look like, as opposed to just what they have been in the past. So, I will also say that some of the additional economic, strategies include workforce training programs. There's also a lot of strategic opportunity related to housing, both affordable housing, as well as providing for programs that would address loss of, rental assistance. So like, if example, if someone's going to be displaced because they're a renter and they couldn't make their rent payments, those programs have been established and been running. The same for homeowners as well. So I think one of the things that, the real flexibility here is just like regular block grant funding, it can be designed to fit the specific needs of your community. So with that, let's move into mitigation. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jake. Jake.
Thanks, Mark. So quick overview of the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, or HMGP. It's funded from your PA disaster. So your categories, you get 15% on top of the 75% that FEMA pays for through PA to mitigate from those disasters happening again. HMGP COVID was authorized on August 5th of 2021, and it was authorized for every state, tribal entity, and territory that falls underneath the United States, because we all were declared COVID PA disaster. So everybody was given HMGP funding and has the ability to apply for the $3.48 billion that was allocated throughout the United States. Difference, and percentage given to different states based on what their public assistance disaster was. You can apply for funds, regular infrastructure projects. There also is 5% and 7% of that funding. 5% of that funding can be utilized for set aside. So that's generator projects, studies that could go into future planning, weather radios, warning sirens, projects of that nature that you can't show cost effectiveness. Also, 7% of those funds can be used for mitigation planning. So if you need to update your mitigation plan, those funds can be utilized as well through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. To talk about HMGP COVID a little bit more in detail, as I stated, it was declared on August 5th of 2021, and you have 12 months from the date of declaration to apply for those funds at the state level or territory level or tribal level. So a lot of the states move ahead pretty quick. Each has their own timelines. So if you are wondering if your application period for COVID HMGP is still available, my best answer would be to reach out to your state hazard mitigation officer or planning team to ask if those funds are still available. I will let you know that my search showed a majority of those had closed because of that 12-month window, which you have to have applications into NEMIS and into FEMA for review by the August 5th timeframe. There are avenues that the state can take to extend that period to 90 days. So you have two of those options. One can be approved by the FEMA region, and the second would have to be approved by FEMA headquarters. But there are chances for those funds to still be available in your state. So even if that state application period is not is closed. Don't let that deter you from potentially going after the future funding that HMGP will have available in your jurisdiction or state or territory, because it's not going away. HMGP program is not going away. It's been around for a long time, and disasters are happening every day, it seems like. So each state and territory will have future funding to potentially assist with that project that you have. For HMGP, the standard match is 25.75. We will get into local match further on in the presentation, so I don't really want to talk about it too in depth here. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dana to talk about CDBG.
Great, thank you, Jake. So yeah, I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery. Many of you might already be familiar with this program administered by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, but some pretty big allocations came out covering the 2020 and 2021 disasters, about over 2.5 billion for 2020 events and over 2.2 billion for 2021 events. This includes hurricanes Ida, Sally, Zeta, Laura, Delta, as well as several West Coast wildfires, some severe storms and tornadoes as well across the country. So a large amount of funding has come out, and as you all are thinking about, how to maximize your funds across federal funding streams, I want to highlight a few of the important considerations when it comes to CDBGDR funding. We know that this is the funding that is kind of intended for long-term recovery, and it's flexible funding that can be used for housing, infrastructure, or economic recovery activities. Because it's a HUD program, obviously housing is the primary or prioritized activity, but infrastructure and economic recovery activities are also allowable with the CDBGDR funds. When thinking about how counties are going to access and look at these funds, HUD in their Federal Register notices identifies the most impacted and distressed counties. They call them mid counties. And within these allocations to states, 80% of the grant funding needs to be spent to benefit those mid counties. So typically, counties will work with the state to access these funds. The funding goes directly to the states as a direct grantee, and we'll design programs that kind of best suit both the disaster and the locations and the communities impacted. And this might include competitive programs or direct allocations, depending again on how the state designs their programs. So it's really important for counties to consider when the CDBGDR funding comes out through their states is this allocation methodology, and then how programs might be scored. So thinking about future impact, leveraged funds, local capacity. As with all HUD funding, the CDBGDR funding, there's a focus on low to moderate income communities and households. So this is always an important consideration for when you're designing or thinking about how to use your CDBGDR funding. And as was mentioned, kind of towards the top of this presentation, but as with, as all of these streams of funding are coming through, we do need to think about duplication of benefits. And so your CDBGDR funding is typically considered your funding of last resort. So it fills an unmet need outside of the other, funding streams, both federal and non-federal, that have come through for disaster recovery. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, as Jake alluded to, but what's unique about the CDBGDR funding is that it can be used as a local match portion on other federally funded projects. And the one thing that I'll flag just early on for you guys is that, it's not always easy to layer, your federal funding together. You will have to consider adding HUD requirements on top of any FEMA or other programmatic requirements. This could include Section 3 or Davis-Bacon. So it's always something to think about early on and consider as you're thinking about using CDBGDR as match. And before we move on to to the infrastructure bill funding, I did want to talk just a little bit about the 2020 Consolidated Federal Register notice that came out with the CDBGDR allocations for the 2020 events. So this was a pretty significant release by HUD that really tried to streamline the CDBGDR program, pulled together a lot of the requirements and regulations into one consolidated notice. One of the biggest changes that you'll see there is that states that were given a DR allocation, part of that allocation is a 15% mitigation set aside. So that means that with each DR allocation, states are granted funding that can be used directly for mitigation activities. So they can be resiliency only activities or potentially mitigation add-ons to traditional disaster recovery activities. What we believe is going to happen, I don't think HUD has made a specific notice, but as many of you know, there had previously been standalone CDBG mitigation grants. And I think that we expect in the future to see that this mitigation funding is going to come out through the traditional CDBGDR grants through this mitigation set aside. The new language also requires states and territories to include information on how programs would affect racial and ethnic minorities within disaster areas. This is becoming a larger and larger focus for HUD. And the last thing that I'll mention, because I think it'll impact how folks see the funding come out through their states, is that the new notice allows for an admin action plan, or rather requires an admin action plan, so that states can release a smaller, focused action plan, just allocating the 5% of their admin funds. So you might see those come out, be published earlier. It's not going to be the full action plans that we traditionally see with CDBGDR funding, but this will allow states access to their admin funds early on. So you might see those hit the street a little bit sooner than we've traditionally seen action plans come out in the past. So I think with that, we can move on to the infrastructure bill funding. On the next slide, please. So on November 5th, 2021, President Biden signed the infrastructure bill into law. As we know, this was a $1 trillion investment, a historic investment in the US's core infrastructure priorities, including roads and bridges, rail, transit, ports, airports, water systems, and broadband. The majority of this funding will run through the US Department of Transportation. So I believe it's close to $600 billion of the infrastructure bill will be running through the US Department of Allocations or Transportation. So this will be the kind of the main focus that we'll discuss with you a little bit today. Counties can access the law's transportation funds through three general ways. Competitively through federal grant programs and competitive processes run by states and states' departments of transportation. Some of the competitive federal grant funding are the RAISE programs and the infra programs. It could also come to counties through sub-allocations based on population from state departments of transportation. This would be the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, other programs like that, or potentially could come to counties through federal formulas like transit formulas and the formula entitlement component of certain programs. So as you see highlighted here, there are several kind of buckets of funding that we'll see coming through this infrastructure bill. The largest one is the roads, bridges, and major projects. This is about a $110 billion investment and does include the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act and has dedicated grant programs to replace and repair bridges and increase funding for major projects through competitive grant programs. I won't go into a ton of details about each of these, but if there are questions, we can talk through those at the end. But there is investment in passenger and freight rail, as well as public transportation, airports, water infrastructure, safety, electric. Yeah, and so we can move on to the next slide. And you'll see that this bill also invests very heavily in climate, energy, and the environment. This is through several kind of investment buckets as well. Resiliency has an allocation of about 47.2 billion. This includes funding for cybersecurity to increase critical infrastructure needs. This also includes addressing legacy pollution and has funding to clean up brownfield and Superfund sites, reclaim abandoned mine lands, as well as, for improving public health and creating good paying jobs. It also includes funding for infrastructure related to electric vehicle charging, which is pretty exciting. And I think it said on the last slide, but clean school buses and ferries as well. There are large investments for these types of activities. And finally, there is a large investment in broadband infrastructure, providing grants to states for broadband deployment and making it more accessible, particularly for low-income families, and expanding that type of access to in-need communities. And so, not to take up too much of our time, I think, pass it back to Jake here to talk a little bit about matching.
Thank you, Dana. So match funds, all fund matching funds. So HMGP, as I stated, was 75-25 is the normal for your normal local and federal share for your match requirements. The Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022 kind of threw a monkey wrench into that, to where they stated that any federally declared disaster between January 1, 2020 and December 31st, 2021 was a 90-10 split. So as I alluded to, some of the states that got moving quickly with their HMGP COVID allocation, or had a disaster declaration that happened right after 1/1 of 2020, they may have had many projects that were ongoing, or even potentially starting to close out and finish by the time this was done. What this does is that it basically allows less project money. At a 75-25 split, you have a certain amount of money for projects. At a 90-10 split, that takes more federal funds away, which means that there are potential projects out there now that states may not be able to afford. The federal government may not have the money that was allocated for that because of the Appropriations Act. So there's going to be a lot of coordination and collaboration between FEMA, states, and local governments to figure out where they're going to bridge that gap. So that's just one thing when it comes to overall project management that you have to think about when it comes to match. You never know what's going to be thrown your way, so be ready for it. BRIC is a 75-25 as well standard. It can go to 90-10 if you are a small impoverished community. FMA, flood mitigation assistance, which is based off NFIP flood insurance premiums. So you have to be an NFIP participating community and have flood insurance to be able to tap into these funds. It is a 75-25 standard match as well, but it will go to a 90-10 split if you are a repetitive loss property, and then 100% if you are a severe repetitive loss property. So how can you fund the 25-10% of the match needed for your project? You can utilize local match, so it could come from cash. Local match can also be in-kind. If you decide to go down the in-kind route, I would make sure that you understand what the responsibilities are for tracking all that documentation up front, because trying to go in on the backside is very, very difficult to go and find that and still be eligible for the match. Sometimes you can spend more time trying to find your local match than it would be if you had just paid for it when it comes to the amount of time to put the application or the documentation together. But if you do it up front, then you have a better chance of succeeding. State appropriations, there are a lot of state appropriations out there, whether it be competitive or not competitive, that will pick up your match. Some states just pick up the match for all federal funds, some mitigation funds, and also CDBG funds. There's also competitive state programs out there for your match. In my time, I've also seen trusts that have been put together that also can be utilized for match in your county or state. CDBGDR and CDBG-MIT, as Dana alluded to, can be utilized for your match for your mitigation project, but you have to follow the rules of CDBGDR and CDBG-MIT in order to be those funds to be utilized for your local match. They lose their federal identity once it goes to the states. That's why you're able to utilize those federal funds. Oh, my mouse got a little carried away on me there. And I will turn it over to, well, I'm going to go ahead and what approaches will maximize funding? So competitive versus non-competitive. I talked a little bit about competitive, non-competitive match funds, how to apply funding sources or cost match, and then a few examples. I'm going to turn it over to Mark real quick to give a talk about that, and then we'll all add a little of our 2 cents before we go to the Q&A.
Great. I appreciate it. Thanks, Jacob. So one of the things that, we want to make sure that we do is, as you're going through the process of identifying the best way to apply this myriad of federal funding, which, comes out under multiple funding streams through multiple agencies, and oftentimes with some varied procurement rules, as Dana, addressed. One of the things that's important is, to first make sure that you've sourced and documented what you believe, all the prior expenses were, and then what are the various funding sources that are available, so that you can make some strategic decisions about where you want those things to be paid for. Also, many of the different pieces of legislation require you to make sure that you're not duplicating, funding sources other than where you're allowed to for the purpose of cost match. So, that's ultimately where we typically work with communities to begin that process. And then we talk about which of those things is competitive versus non-competitive. And I'm going to give just a couple of quick examples of why that's so important. So obviously the funding that comes out under block grant DR and the funding that, comes out specifically under ARPA are both very broad and can be applied in a multitude of different ways. But the reality is there's also things that you can pay for there that you could pay for with, say, the FEMA Public Assistance Program, whether it's some of the staff time or some of the actual response activities, that were conducted. And what's important is to look at the total dollar amounts that you may have, set aside for your community under the different funding sources. And if you don't have to use that because you can go against a pot of money like FEMA PA for portions of it, it leaves the rest of that more flexible money available for initiatives that will help your county fare better in the future, both against future pandemics as well as making sure that you've accounted for economic impacts on where you want your community to be, as opposed to maybe where your community has been in the past. So, Dana also mentioned things like Davis-Bacon, Title III, and the fact that typically, in the cycle of disaster funding, you'll see that, a lot of your nonprofits, are in early, assisting with things like sheltering, evacuation, feeding. And then you see FEMA come to town with a lot of their response assets to augment, state and local, where state and local can't address all of that or to the scale it needs to be addressed. And then some of their initial disaster funding. And then sometimes, a year or two later, you'll see funding come out on the block grant DR side under the formulas on what gets essentially, passed by Congress. So one of the things that's important is to make sure that as you begin work on all of these activities, and you may have been just finalizing some of your FEMA grants, but when you go to do the contracting for, let's just say that it's an infrastructure project, and you go to do contracting that involves construction, that you may want to make sure that those contracts are compliant, even though you're using FEMA money, to also be compliant with HUD funding, et cetera, because that at least allows you the opportunity later, if it's also a HUD qualifying project, for you to be able to apply HUD money from the block grant end as match. even if you didn't initially plan to do that. It preserves some of that flexibility. So those are some of the strategies that we would mention, early on. I think that we kind of wanted to open this up also for Jacob and Dana to provide some additional examples of how we've seen some of our clients apply and layer that funding. So we'll go through a couple of quick examples and then we'll get to questions. As I said, we wanted to preserve as much of the time, as we can for that. So it looks like we'll probably have 20 minutes worth of Q&A, which is a nice size. So with that, Jacob, Dana, turn it over to you for some examples.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Just real quick, I'm going to give a personal example of mine. Coming in as a young state hazard mitigation officer with money coming out of my ears, maybe eight plans out of 105 counties are complete. So I've tapped out those local match that they have and all the projects they wanted to do are done. So we had a really, really difficult time trying to utilize the funds that I had available through mitigation at that time. And it would have been nice to know that there are companies like ourselves or other big companies out there that can assist us. Or it didn't have to be a big company, it can just be one or two people, but I held a separate hat. I was logistics chief in our EOC too. So I wasn't doing mitigation full time, and a lot of emergency managers and government entities and people have separate hats. So they're not always ready to go when these funding opportunities come forth. So it would behoove you to have someone in your back pocket to assist you that goes, because these programs are not easy. They're very convoluted. I will go ahead and say that since I'm part of mitigation, that mitigation is most likely the most convoluted and most difficult, but that's for, my opinion, so to speak. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dana if she wants to provide any examples.
Sure. One of the great opportunities that I've had is to work with some local county and city governments on accessing CDBGDR funding. And we know that the process can be long and complicated. And what we do see, and I wanted to touch on this a little bit, are areas that you can kind of prep for in getting ready for this, especially as we see a lot of the funding coming out through competitive processes. So we've worked with counties in Texas and in Florida to access their state CDBGDR funding. And what's really, really important, the kind of big things that we always tell folks to focus on when they're putting together those applications and designing projects for this funding, is to think about your beneficiaries, because there is that low to moderate income focus on the CDBGDR funding. Sometimes it's hard to put like a great infrastructure project that's in a downtown area forward for that funding, because the immediate area isn't necessarily a low moderate income population area. It's not quite a good fit. So thinking through, what projects might have the most impact on those communities, that's what we look for first. Local capacity to implement also tends to kind of be a stumbling block, because these are, large grants, different from, what you're usually getting on an annual basis. And so the states and HUD want to see, not that you maybe are at full capacity, but that you have a plan to get there, and how you're going to address potential capacity gaps in implementing your CDBGDR funding. And then finally, I do think that what Mark said, I want to kind of reiterate, thinking through where making projects potentially eligible in your procurement stage, so that you could use HUD funding in the future, it can be really significant and make your lives so much easier down the line for match programs. HUD is really focused on procurement, making sure that goes through correctly. That's what they like to focus on for audits and monitorings and all. So we see that the local governments that are kind of focused on really being thoughtful and strategic about which projects they put forward for CDBGDR funding that are a good fit for that funding source tend to be more successful.
Great. Well, just before we go to questions, so one other thing I will just bring up is that there is also oftentimes when it relates to resiliency for communities and for planning for things that are not direct one-to-one replacements of something that were damaged or couldn't be funded or, maybe has had a lack of upkeep, right, is the fact that funding, if you're thinking far enough down the stream, can come from money that, as an example, some of the grant programs require to see some local skin in the game. They want to see that this has been something that you've identified the hazard, maybe you've conducted a study on, perhaps you've already built a plan on, but you don't have money to execute a particular program or a project. And so some of the things, example, starting with FEMA on even the public assistance side, is that, there were, grant programs on the FEMA side where if you set a target for what would be spent and you were efficient and you underspent that amount, it allowed you to take that additional dollars and put it towards, all different types of mitigation, including planning. And so some communities were able to take that planning from prior events and say, here are places where I know I have hazards, but I haven't been able to fully quantify or articulate that. Let me at least get a study done, right? So that I've got one on the books. That'll make me more competitive for future grant dollars, right? On the HMGP side, potentially, relates to, BRIC as well as, block grant MIT funds, because it'll show that, this is an ongoing issue and we've been planning for it. And then so, once the study was done, they were also able to identify, as an example, that, there are different things they have to do in their community standing to make sure that, that they're consistent with the state hazard mitigation plan so they can score higher, they can have more funding available. And all of this work, in many cases, is able to be funded by the grant activity itself. All the grants we're talking about come with an administrative, whether it's a percentage or a set aside, or there's a different calculation method for each, right? And you can talk about how that work gets done. But the good news is you don't always have to take it on as an additional burden and a second hat that somebody has to wear. You're welcome to go out. And again, this is not a commercial for our company, but definitely good advice to get, a consultant or a group of consultants that is familiar with the broad scope of how all the funding works, and get that strategic advice, and perhaps even get the staff augmentation to make, the running of these grants and the additional dollars more seamless to people in the county that have everyday regular jobs to do or need to get back to those jobs, and can't be in a 2 or 3 year perpetual cycle of managing their regular job and managing all these disaster grants. And it's also a risk reduction strategy, because if, people are doing this as a secondary function, and not testing against anybody's expertise or experience. But the reality is, if you have multiple things you're trying to achieve, there's a possibility, right, as things go through those audits and go through those closeouts, you don't want to put yourself in a position where somebody's coming back to you and asking for that money back. So getting the good advice up front, especially starting with procurement, is key. Both FEMA's IG and HUD's IG will tell you that if they were to stack up the top 10 reasons why they ever ask for money back, 6 out of the 10 are always going to be related to procurement on both sides of the house. So starting early with good advice is important. So with that, we're just going to open it up for questions. We want to make sure that we allow for some group participation. So. Any questions? And in Teams, I know I can see how people are asking questions. So I may ask for some NACo facilitation help if people are asking questions and I can't see or hear them. So.
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's Kara from NACo. Just a reminder to please drop any questions you have in the chat, and then I can read them out to you.
Okay, fantastic. And I pulled up the chat box so that I can make sure I'm monitoring if that's how they're coming in. So while we are waiting for a question or two, one of the things I would also just, share with the group, is that there are certainly a lot of communities that, as they go through this process, make public their plans, either A, because there's a requirement for sharing publicly information and for public engagement on certain dollars, but also, just for sharing best practices across the board, because there is so much funding that's available. So I don't know that if everybody's gotten a full view of the kind of dollars that we're talking about being available, over the last year to 2 years. But total COVID-19 funding is in excess of $5.4 trillion. So, 252 billion of that is coming out from Health and Human Services, 112 billion coming from Department of Education, Department of Labor, 377 billion. The SBA, with the programs that it can run, 761 billion. Department of Transportation, 70 billion. Our friends at FEMA and HUD, 47 billion through public assistance, 12.4 billion through HUD's programs, and directly from Treasury, another 975 billion. So it is, I'll just say, more funding is available at this time than probably ever in at least my time doing this kind of work. So, it really is a good time if there are things your communities need that fit these programs and definitions that you find them. So it looks like we have a question here. It says, this is from Harrison Preman. Maybe I don't know because I'm still a new hire, but how many of these opportunities are a one-time deal, as in this is the only time they'll be available? So very specifically, those are things like the CARES Act and ARPA. These are things that, sunset as of a particular date, and as of right now have targeted end dates. As I mentioned with ARPA, it's 2024, that the work has to be completed by that time. Others, like community development block grants, FEMA HMGP, and FEMA public assistance, at this time will continue to operate in perpetuity based on their normal eligibility criteria. So it's kind of a mixed bag. But as far as funding out at one time, this is really unique. I've never seen this level of available funding in the past 30 years. So I would take this as a very special time to consider things that you want to get done. Any other questions from the group?
While we're waiting for questions, Mark, I'll go ahead and get another example on match funding. So we utilize match funding for an elevation project or a buyout project. It was a large acquisition demolition buyout, and the locals did not have the match. Some of the homeowners did not have the match, and they were in a low moderate income, situation. So we reached out to CDBGDR, and they picked up the match for that project. And that came from them being part of the mitigation team, being on part of that team. So it's good to be able to be part of that team or to get on one of those teams in order to, boost your resources or your contacts to assist you with your grants moving forward.
Good advice. So, one other thing, just so everybody is aware, if there are questions, and again, I know we threw a lot of information out there to you. So, I'll just say, if we don't get a tremendous number of questions, we won't sit here and wax poetic for the rest of the time. But you can always reach back out to us, through your contacts at NACo. We're a proud sponsor of NACo, and we'll always make ourselves available to just answer questions that you have. So we do this typically throughout the year at conferences and virtual venues like this. So we're glad to provide any advice we can. Okay, let's see. Okay, I'll send another. Is there one central hub that lists all of these grants? Man, I wish there was. So unfortunately, there's not. There are places to go to track grant funding collectively, depending on criteria you set up. Some of these are third-party systems that are used to do this. Others are literally just to go to the funding committees like at Congress, and they'll publish, what those are. For the most part, to some degree, you do have to know that these things are available in order to go looking for them. Others there, where there are, entitlement communities and other things, there's already a pre-established relationship, and those communities are informed every year how much money of different types they're getting. But there really isn't a one-stop shop for all this information. I wish there was. And now the next question from Yolanda Moran is, will this webinar be available to watch later? And the answer is yes, indeed, they are recording it. So you can certainly do that.
Also, Mark, there was a question from Leanne Patterson. Second question right before Harrison asked a second. If a customer is interested in using funding through ARPA for a technology upgrade, are they also able to utilize a grant at the same time if that grant allows usage for technology upgrades?
So if you're funding different parts or stages of a project with two different funding streams, the answer is most likely yes, but I would need to have a little more information on what the other funding stream is. But on the ARPA side, you don't have to necessarily fund a project in its total entirety with that, right? It's for augmentation and for increase, right, in capability. So as long as the ARPA project is correctly described and funded according to the rules for accounting for the ARPA funds, that portion's eligible. And if you have other funding that you were using for the other portion of that and you're following those rules, it shouldn't be a problem. So, but if you want to discuss it more directly, or you're welcome to reach out again outside of the webinar, and we'd be glad to discuss it with you. Okay. Any other questions? We got about 8 minutes left, at least from my watch. So we probably have time for at least one or two more. Okay. And I don't know if anybody saw, but Dana Johnson on our team, she has posted a note reminding anyone you can also reach out to Dana Johnston after this webinar, and she lists her email, so that's captured in the chat. So you're welcome to ask your questions directly of her. She'll route it to whichever of us is most appropriate to answer, and that's not just the three of us that are on the call, but any one of the couple hundred experts that we employ on the particular question you have, and we'll be glad to get you some answers back.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to the Tidal Basin team. We really, really appreciate your time. This was an incredibly useful overview. And as mentioned, if anyone listening to the call has further questions, please do reach out to Dana Johnson at djohnson@tidalbasin.com. And feel free to also reach out to me directly, Kara Hackett, if you've got any further questions about upcoming webinars.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everyone.